Now, attempts are being made to condemn these landmarks of history to oblivion, along with the names of state and military figures of the Russian Empire, without whose efforts modern Ukraine would not have many big cities or even access to the Black Sea. A monument to Alexander Suvorov was recently demolished in Poltava. What is there to say? Are you renouncing your own past? The so-called colonial heritage of the Russian Empire? Well, in this case, be consistent. Next, notably, Article 17 of the Constitution of Ukraine stipulates that deploying foreign military bases on its territory is illegal. However, as it turns out, this is just conventionality that can be easily circumvented. Ukraine is home to NATO training missions, which are in fact foreign military bases. They just call a base a mission and then they're done with it. Kyiv has long proclaimed a strategic course on joining NATO. Indeed, each country is entitled to pick its own security system and enter into military alliances. There would be no problem with that if it were not for one but. International documents expressly stipulate the principle of equal and indivisible security, which includes obligations not to strengthen one's own security at the expense of the security of other states. This is stated in the 1999 OSCE Charter for European Security, adopted in Istanbul, and the 2010 OSCE Astana Declaration. In other words, the choice of pathways towards ensuring security should not pose a threat to other states, whereas Ukraine joining NATO is a direct threat to Russia's security. Let me remind you that at the Bucharest NATO summit held in April 2008, the United States pushed through a decision to the effect that the Ukraine, and by the way, Georgia, would become NATO members. Many European allies of the United States were well aware of the risk associated with this prospect already then, but were forced to put up with the will of their senior partner. The Americans simply used them to carry out a clearly anti-Russian policy. A number of NATO member states are still very skeptical about Ukraine joining NATO. We are getting signals from some European capitals telling us not to worry, since it will not happen literally overnight. In fact, our U.S. partners are saying the same thing as well. All right, then, we respond. If it does not happen tomorrow, then it will happen the day after tomorrow. What does it change from the historical perspective? Nothing at all. Furthermore, we are aware of the U.S. leadership's position in words that active hostilities in eastern Ukraine do not rule out the possibility of that country joining NATO if it meets NATO criteria and overcomes corruption. All the while, they are trying to convince us over and over again that NATO is a peace-loving and purely defensive alliance that poses no threat to Russia. Again, they want us to take their word for it. But we are well aware of the real value of these words. In 1990, when German unification was discussed, the United States promised the Soviet leadership that NATO jurisdiction or military presence will not expand 1 inch to the east, and that the unification of Germany will not lead to the spread of NATO's military organization to the east. This is a quote. They issued lots of verbal assurances, all of which turned out to be empty phrases. Later, they began to assure us that the accession to NATO by Central and Eastern European countries would only improve relations with Moscow, relieve these countries of the fears steeped in their bitter historical legacy, and even create a belt of countries that are friendly towards Russia. However, the exact opposite happened. The governments of certain Eastern European countries, speculating on Russophobia, brought their complexes and stereotypes about the Russian threat to the alliance, insisted on building up the collective defense potentials, deploying them primarily against Russia. Worse still, that happened in the 1990s and the early 2000s, when, thanks to our openness and goodwill, relations between Russia and the West had reached a high level. Russia has fulfilled all of its obligations, including the pullout from Germany from Central and Eastern Europe, making an immense contribution to overcoming the legacy of the Cold War. We have consistently proposed various cooperation options, including in the NATO-Russian Council and the OSCE formats. Moreover, I will say something I have never said publicly. I will say it now for the first time. When then outgoing U.S. President Bill Clinton visited Moscow in 2000, I asked him how America would feel about admitting Russia to NATO. I will not reveal all the details of that conversation, but the reaction to my question was, let us say, quite restrained. And the Americans' true attitude to that possibility can actually be seen from their subsequent steps with regard to our country. I'm referring to the overt support for terrorists in the North Caucasus, the disregard for our security demands and concerns, NATO's continued expansion, withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, and so on. It raises the question, why? What is all this about? What is the purpose? All right, you do not want to see us as friends or allies, but why make us an enemy? I think we should take Russia and let him in NATO. Let Russia in NATO. If you turn an enemy into a friend, have you not stopped them from being an enemy? There can only be one answer. This is not about our political regime or anything like that. They just do not need a big independent country like Russia around. This is the answer to all questions. This is the source of America's traditional policy towards Russia, hence the attitude to all our security proposals today. One glance at the map is enough to see to what extent Western countries have kept their promise to refrain from NATO's eastward expansion. They just cheated. We've seen 5 waves of NATO expansion, one after another. Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary were admitted in 1999. Then in 2004, we saw Bulgaria and Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. It was 2004, and then 2009 you had Croatia and Albania, and then 2017 Montenegro, and then 2020 North Macedonia. As a result, the alliance, its military infrastructure have reached Russia's borders. This is one of the key causes of the European security crisis. It has had the most negative impact on the entire system of international relations and led to the loss of mutual trust. The situation continues to deteriorate, including in the strategic area. Thus, positioning areas for interceptor missiles are being established in Romania and Poland as part of the U.S. project to create a global missile defense system. It is common knowledge that the launchers deployed there can be used for Tomahawk cruise missiles, offensive strike systems. In addition, the United States is developing its all-purpose Standard Missile 6, which can provide air and missile defense as well as strike ground and surface targets. In other words, the allegedly defensive U.S. missile defense system is developing and expanding its new offensive capabilities. The information we have gives us good reason to believe that Ukraine's accession to NATO and the subsequent deployment of NATO facilities has already been decided, and it's only a matter of time. We clearly understand that given this scenario, I gotta smoke a little weed after that one. Whew. We clearly understand that given this scenario, the level of military threats to Russia will increase dramatically several times over, and I would like to emphasize at this point that the risk of a sudden strike at our country will multiply. I will explain that American strategic planning documents confirm the possibility of a so-called preemptive strike at enemy missile systems. We also know the main adversary of the United States and NATO is Russia. NATO documents officially declare our country to be the main threat to Euro-Atlantic security. Ukraine will serve as an advanced bridgehead for such a strike. If our ancestors heard about this, they would probably simply not believe this. We do not want to believe this today either, but it is what it is. I would like people in Russia and Ukraine to understand this. Many Ukrainian airfields are located not far from our borders. NATO's tactical aviation deployed there, including precision weapon carriers, will be capable of striking at our territory to the depth of the Volgograd, Kazan, Samara, Astrakhan line. The deployment of reconnaissance radars on Ukrainian territory will allow NATO to tightly control Russia's airspace up to the Urals. Finally, after the U.S. destroyed the INF Treaty, the Pentagon has been openly developing many land based attack weapons, including ballistic missiles that are capable of hitting targets at a distance of up to 5,500 kilometers. If deployed in Ukraine, such systems will be able to hit targets in Russia's entire European part. The flying time of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Moscow would be less than 35 minutes. Ballistic missiles from Kharkiv will take 7 to 8 minutes, and hypersonic assault weapons 4 to 5 minutes. It is like a knife to the throat. I have no doubt that they hope to carry out these plans as they did many times in the past, expanding NATO eastward, moving their military infrastructure to Russian borders, and fully ignoring our concerns, protests, and warnings. Excuse me, but they simply did not care at all about such things and did whatever they deemed necessary. Of course, they're going to behave in the same way in the future, following a well-known proverb: the dogs bark, but the caravan goes on. The dogs bark, but the caravan goes on. Let me say right away, we do not accept this behavior and we will never accept it. That said, Russia has always advocated the resolution of the most complicated problems by political and diplomatic means at the negotiating table. We are well aware of our enormous responsibility when it comes to regional and global stability. Back in 2008, Russia put forth an initiative to conclude a European security treaty under which not a single Euro-Atlantic state or international organization could strengthen their security at the expense of the security of others. However, our proposal was rejected right off the bat on the pretext that Russia should not be allowed to put limits on NATO activities. Furthermore, it was made explicitly clear to us that only NATO members can have legally binding security guarantees. Last December, we handed over to our Western partners a draft treaty between the Russian Federation and the United States of America on security guarantees, as well as a draft agreement on measures to ensure the security of the Russian Federation and NATO member states. The United States and NATO responded with general statements. There were kernels of rationality in them as well, but they concerned matters of secondary importance, and it all looked like an attempt to drag the issue out and to lead the discussion astray. We responded to this accordingly and pointed out that we were ready to follow the path of negotiations, provided, however, that all issues are considered as a package that includes Russia's core proposals, which contain 3 key points. First, to prevent further NATO expansion. Second, to have the alliance refrain from deploying assault weapon systems on Russian borders. And finally, rolling back the bloc's military capability and infrastructure in Europe to where they were in 1997 when the NATO-Russia Founding Act was signed. These principled proposals of ours have been ignored. To reiterate, our Western partners have once again vocalized the all too familiar formulas that each state is entitled to freely choose ways to ensure its security or to join any military union or alliance. That is, nothing has changed in their stance, and we keep hearing the same old references to NATO's notorious open door policy. Moreover, they are again trying to blackmail us, and they're threatening us with sanctions, which, by the way, they will introduce no matter what, as Russia continues to strengthen its sovereignty and its armed forces. To be sure, they will never think twice before coming up with or just fabricating a pretext for yet another sanction attack, regardless of the development in Ukraine. Their one and only goal is to hold back the development of Russia, and they will keep doing so just as they did before, even without any formal pretext, just because we exist and will never compromise our sovereignty, national interest, or values. I'd like to be clear and straightforward in the current circumstances when our proposals for an equal dialogue on fundamental issues have actually remained unanswered by the United States and NATO. When the level of threats to our country has increased significantly, Russia has every right to respond in order to ensure its security. That is exactly what we will do. With regard to the state of affairs in Donbass, we see that the ruling Kyiv elites never stop publicly making clear their unwillingness to comply with the Minsk package of measures to settle the conflict, which are not interested in a peaceful settlement. On the contrary, they're trying to orchestrate a blitzkrieg in Donbass, as was the case in 2014 and 2015. We all know how these reckless schemes ended. Not a single day goes by without Donbass communities coming under shelling attacks. The recently formed large military force makes use of attack drones, heavy equipment, missiles, artillery, and multiple rocket launchers. The killing of civilians, the blockade, the abuse of people, including children, women, and the elderly, continue unabated. As we say, there is no end in sight to this. Meanwhile, the so-called civilized world, which our Western colleagues proclaim themselves the only representatives of, prefers not to see this, as if this horror and genocide, which almost 4 million people are facing, do not exist. But they do exist, and only because these people did not agree with the West-supported coup in Ukraine in 2014 and opposed the transition towards the Neanderthal and aggressive nationalism and neo-Nazism, which have been elevated in Ukraine to a rank of national policy. Transition towards the Neanderthal. They're going back to the days of the Neanderthal. They're fighting for their elementary right to live on their own land, to speak their own language, and to preserve their culture and traditions. How long can this tragedy continue? How much longer can one put up with this? Russia has done everything to preserve Ukraine's territorial integrity all these years. It has persistently and patiently pushed for the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2202 of February 17, 2015, which consolidated the Minsk package of measures of February 12th, 2015 to settle the situation in Donbass. Everything was in vain. Presidents and Rada deputies come and go, but deep down the aggressive and nationalistic regime that seized power in Kyiv remained unchanged. It is entirely a product of the 2014 coup, and those who then embarked on the path of violence, bloodshed, and lawlessness did not recognize then and do not recognize now any solution to the Donbass issue other than a military one. In this regard, I consider it necessary to take a long overdue decision and to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. I would like to ask the Federal Assembly of the Lugansk Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation to support this decision and then ratify the Treaty of Friendship and Mutual Assistance with both republics. These two documents will be prepared and signed shortly. We want those who seize and continue to hold power in Kyiv to immediately stop hostilities. Otherwise, the responsibility for the possible continuation of the bloodshed will lie entirely on the conscience of Ukraine's ruling regime. As I announce the decisions taken today, I remain confident in the support of Russia's citizens and the country's patriotic forces. Thank you for your attention. Sincerely, Vladimir, the piece of shit, Pooty Poo, justifying his fucking cooey coo.